Okay, this is a quick review or preview, depending on when you're watching it, of the rhetorical analysis essay for Mr. Singleton's class. The idea is to give you a basic idea of what to expect on the rhetorical analysis timed writing on the essay on the AP test. Remember, this is just basically an overview. So, if you want more details on the specific strategies and some of those things, you'll need to look at some of the other videos that are about those strategies. The rhetorical analysis essay is unique because it's asking you to do a different type of writing than you're probably used to doing. It's very different from the synthesis essay. It's very different from the argument essay. Those two essays have a lot in common. This one is very different. So when we're asking you to analyze rhetoric, first of all, if you don't understand what analyze means, you can go look at our video lesson on analysis, and that should help with that. But if we're asking you to analyze rhetoric, you need to know what rhetoric is. So, rhetoric is how a writer or speaker persuades his or her audience using specific techniques. So, that brings us to the rhetorical triangle. You probably remember this from other presentations. This is really important to think about when we talk about writing a rhetorical analysis. A lot of times when we've asked you in the past in your English classes to analyze something, a lot of times you focus on analyzing the subject or ideas that we're talking about. And the rhetorical analysis is very different because we want you to focus on analyzing instead the choices the writer or speaker is making, the strategies they're using, and then what effect that has on the reader or audience. So, where you're used to maybe writing about this in an analysis, now we're asking you to analyze the interaction going on between the speaker and the audience. How are the techniques that the writer or speaker using affecting the specific audience that they're writing to? So basically, when you write a rhetorical analysis, the big question that you're trying to answer, the question that you're asking yourself and that you're trying to answer with your essay is, what choices did the speaker or writer make in how they communicate their ideas? And the key word there is how they communicate their ideas. So, therefore, a rhetorical analysis is when we talk about what tools and tricks we see the writer using and explain what effect they have on the audience. So, it's when we write about the tools and the tricks or the rhetorical strategies that we see the writer using. And then the next part of that is explaining how they affected the audience. Okay, so that's what a rhetorical analysis is. So when you write a rhetorical analysis, you're going to be writing about the rhetorical devices, or another way to say that is the rhetorical strategies or the rhetorical terms or techniques that you see the author using. And those rhetorical devices or strategies are essentially just the tools and tricks. Okay, those things, you might have heard us talk about things like this in your English classes before, and we call them literary devices or literary techniques or literary strategies. Those would be things like theme, simile, metaphor. When we talk about those in a piece of rhetoric or in a rhetorical analysis, we call them rhetorical devices. So you can have similes and metaphors and all those kinds of things as well. In fact, if I was to tell you just a quick example of some of these rhetorical devices or strategies, they would include things like similes, metaphors, connotation, tone, imagery, overstatement, or we call that hyperbole, right? Emotional appeals, pathos, and many, many other things. So, if there's one thing you need to remember about what makes a rhetorical analysis different from other types of writing you've done, it's that you're writing not so much about what they say as how they say it. You're focusing on how the writer writes, the strategies and techniques that the writer uses. So that brings us to some things you need to remember about this type of writing. The first thing is remember what the name of this course is. The official name of this course is AP English Language and composition. Your senior year, when you take an AP course, it's called AP English Literature and Composition. You focus more on literature. This is a language test. This is a test about how you use and how you analyze and interpret English language. Okay? So at the end of the day, when you take the AP test and what you're trying to do is show college professors. That's AP teachers and college professors are who grade these things. You're trying to show these people that you already write on a college level, that you don't need to take a college writing class. You're trying to write in a way that's going to impress them with your writing skills. That's the whole point of the essay section. So if there's something you need to remember while you're writing, is that this is the ultimate goal. You're showing off your language skills. This makes this particularly important with the rhetorical analysis essay, and that's why it's in the AP English language test, because not only is that showing off your writing and your language skills, but it's showing your knowledgeability of what good writers do. At the end of the day, you are writing about writing in a rhetorical analysis. So not only are you displaying your good language skills, but you're showing that you can talk about what good writers do, that you can talk about those strategies. So you must write about how the author writes. And by how, we mean write about the writing and communication tricks and tools and strategy the author's using. Hopefully that has made its way into your head by this point in the presentation. A few common errors that some students make when they try to write this essay are these things here. One thing you want to avoid is do not get stuck simply summarizing the author's points or getting into what he is saying too much. When you stick on that and when you summarize, you're missing the point. Okay, and I'll show you an example of that in a little bit, a student sample that did that. Also, do not enter the argument and start debating whether or not you agree or disagree with the author's argument. That's similar to what we do in a synthesis essay or an argument essay, but this type of writing, you do not enter the argument with them. You are simply, as a non biased party viewing it, talking about the strategies the author uses, not whether or not you agree with them. So let me run through a short play-by-play of how you would go about planning a rhetorical analysis essay. And the first step is that you would go ahead and read the introductory information to the text you'll be analyzing, because that info is extremely helpful. If you look at a AP prompt like this, and we'll be looking at one in a second, I'll kind of show you one over here. If you look at an AP prompt like this, you'll notice that just like a lot of worksheets and things you've seen in the past, there's this area that gives you some directions at the beginning. Well, a lot of us have trained our minds because we've done so many worksheets. We've trained our minds to just skip right over this and get started. And that works a lot of times when you talk about worksheets, but on the AP test, you have to read this information because it is not just directions. In fact, if you don't read this information, you miss out on the entire context of the piece of writing you're going to read. What they do is they use this little passage at the beginning, this little introductory paragraph, to tell you specifically who wrote this, why they were writing it, who they were writing it to, and you need to know all those things to be able to interpret it, to know who the author and who the audience is, and you also need that to be able to write a thesis statement. So for instance, in this one, this letter that we were looking at here, it explains, the letter below was written by Samuel Johnson in response to a woman who had asked him to obtain the Archbishop of Canterbury's patronage to have her son sent to the university. If you don't read that, you don't know that first this woman had sent a letter to Samuel Johnson and that this is Samuel Johnson's response to the woman. You don't know what the woman asked him. And that would be really confusing if you were to try to read this without knowing that. This information is really, really important. So read the introductory information always. The next step would be to actually read the text, read whatever it is they're wanting you to analyze. And while doing that, you need to actively take notes, and those notes need to be about the strategies you see the author using, right? This makes sense. If we're writing an analysis of the strategies, while we're reading that text, we need to be looking for those strategies, making notes. If you think an author might be using a strategy, maybe you don't know the name of it, but you can see something's going on. They're making some kind of choice there. Underline it. All right, as long as you can describe what the author is doing, you don't have to know the actual name of the term. You just need to be able to talk intelligently about strategies that the author is using in their writing. Okay, finally, step three. Once you've read that piece and you've written down the strategies you see the author using, you would want to pick out about 3 strategies that you can write about with the most confidence and that are most dominant in the author's style. So this is a time they only pick pieces of writing to use on this test that they feel like are really good examples of strategic rhetorical writing. So you should be able to find a lot of different strategies that you could write about. Pick out the 3 you feel like you can write about best. Obviously, if you don't really know what anecdotes are and can't really explain very well how they work and what they do and how they're working in that passage, you don't want to use that. You want to use things you're sure of that you can talk about intelligently and with confidence. That makes a huge difference on this type of essay. Finally, you'll want to write a thesis statement, all right, and we're going to go over that a little more. Once you've done all these things, you'll write a thesis statement for rhetorical analysis, and you'll notice that a thesis statement for a rhetorical analysis is different than we would write it for the synthesis essay, even though there's similarities. Also, keep in mind that this is a timed writing, so you have 40 minutes to write this essay. Okay, that's a good point to keep in mind. Several people went through a lot of these rhetorical analysis prompts that the AP test has given over the past few years, and they noticed that there were some patterns, that there were certain strategies that they saw popping up more, being used more in these prompts than other strategies. So here are some of the more common strategies that you might want to go back and review, because you'll in all likelihood see at least 1 or 2 of them. So colloquial language would be one. That's like colloquialisms, right? Elevated language, right? Hyperbole, over exaggeration, right? Addressing the counter argument, connotation. Connotation is connected to and creates tone. So that's one you could write about. You'll see shifts happening a lot. Of course, rhetorical questions are popular, and forced teaming is popular. Notice it's not called forced teaming. Make sure you have that D there. So a little bit more about writing a thesis statement for a rhetorical analysis. Let me show you a quick idea of what that would look like. You would need to make a plan, okay? And the first thing is you would read that introductory information, and usually in that introductory information you will find all the important context you need. You'll find out what the author's purpose was, who the author was, and maybe what's the context here, what's going on. You will need all of that info from the introductory information to be able to write an intelligent, understandable thesis statement. So let's imagine that you get a prompt and you find out that this is a script from a public service announcement that George Clooney put out, and his purpose was to convince people to help with the crisis in Haiti. And while you were reading that, you discovered that he used several strategies. You noticed forced teaming, pathos, humor, hyperbole, contingency, and logos. You would want to take that information and first weave together an introductory statement. So maybe it would end up being something like this. In his public service announcement, George Clooney tries to convince his audience to help out with the crisis in Haiti. There's the first half of your thesis statement. Now you would add to that using a phrase like by using, and then just listing the rhetorical strategies that you picked out to write about. Obviously, you can't write about every strategy that's used in there, so you want to pick the 3 best. So, for example, this is what a thesis statement finished might look like for a rhetorical analysis essay. In his public service announcement, George Clooney tries to convince his audience to help out with the crisis in Haiti by using pathos, humor, and contingency. Then you would write an essay in which you talk about pathos, humor, and contingency and show how they're used in that piece of writing. So this is the example of the prompt that we were looking at a second ago, and I wanted to show you some student examples of responses to this prompt. So these are students who read this prompt, and notice that the prompt, we could even start analyzing this by looking at the first word. It's clearly a letter, and it starts with the word madam. If you're writing a letter to a woman, there's a lot of different words you can use for a woman. You could use madam, you could use woman, you could use hey lady. There's a lot of different things you can say, but this author chooses madam. And if you notice throughout this piece of writing, the author uses madam quite a bit in here, right? Here it is again. That would be a strategy, and we may not have a name for that strategy. We might call it repetition. We might call it using respectful terminology. We could call it a lot of different things, but the point is that on this prompt, that's something we could notice the author using and we could write about as a strategy. So let's see how some people chose to write about this. These are actual student responses from the AP test. This first example scored an 8 out of 9. That's really hard to do. That's an excellent piece of writing. So let's look at part of what they wrote. First of all, you'll notice it's not the prettiest piece of writing in the world. It doesn't have to be. What you will notice is that it's written with good, strong, impressive language, and that the author writes with confidence. Especially on a rhetorical analysis, it's important that even if you're not 100% sure about what each strategy is and how it works, is that you write confidently. That makes up for a lot of your weaknesses. So let's look at this example. In his refusal to recommend a woman's son for patronage to a university, Samuel Johnson carefully constructs his argument against talking to the bishop and gradually builds support for his position. His denial is most marked by, and successful due to, the use of definition, there's a strategy, a subtle shift in tone, there's a strategy, and the application of the appeals to logic or logos. There's the third strategy this author's writing about, this student. Combined, these devices successfully conveyed Johnson's unwillingness to complete the task while still allowing him to remain cordial. Let's see how they write about the specific strategy. We saw a thesis statement in there. We saw that. Let's see what happens when they start actually talking about it. So initially, Johnson anticipates the emotion of the mother awaiting receipt of the letter, hope. Notice right off the bat, they're talking about the author and they're talking about the audience. That's what most of this writing is. You're talking about the author and how it affects the audience, how the author's choices affect and interact with the audience. Rather than accusing her of being wrong in holding this emotion, Johnson defines the term hope as a pleasure immediately enjoyed and as an expectation immediately indulged. Now notice, instead of just saying, oh, the author uses definition and defines and moving on, they actually go back to the text and give us the example of where it's being used. You need to do this every time. When you talk about a strategy being used, you need to show us the strategy being used, right? And this is where the author gets very impressive, is in their explanation of how it works on the audience. While obvious in intent and meaning, the indirect connection of disappointment with hope allows Johnson to let the mother down more tactfully than if he directly stated his rejection. Furthermore, the use of definition allows the reader to make the connection and accept the conclusion, rejection, on her own rather than being able to directly place blame on Johnson. The use of definition allows the writer to distance himself from the action of denial. Notice, this is not summary. This student writer is doing a great job of writing about how this author uses the strategies he uses to affect the audience. That's what we're going for. This essay scored a 5 out of 9. Remember, if you can average a score of 5 on these essays, you get half the multiple choice right, you're in position to pass. Let's see how they started theirs out. They take about 2 sentences to ease their reader into the topic of the essay, and then they deliver a very effective thesis statement that has 2 strategies listed in it. I imagine if this author would have analyzed one more strategy, they may have scored higher than a 5. But let's see how they did. They did a good job with what they had. When a letter or other form is submitted, such as a college application or an AP test, there's always a feeling of hope and excitement when waiting for the response. However, if the response comes back with denial or negative news, all hopes are gone and feelings are crushed. Here's your thesis statement. Samuel Johnson does a good job in crafting his denial to a woman's request, for he shows his sympathy and understanding of the woman's feelings by the use of his diction, And he explains his reason for denial by portraying his point of view. So really they're talking about the use of diction and the author's use of explaining things. Those are two strategies you could write about. Johnson shows his sincerity and understanding by using words to describe how the mother may feel. He apologizes to the woman as he tells her his difficulties, right? And then we have the quote where you actually see the apology, right? It talks about the connotation, picks out the specific words that they think have negative connotation, and takes time to explain it. If you do that, you're on the right track. So let's look at this last example. This last example scored a 2 out of 9, so this is not a very good example, and I think you'll see really quickly why they didn't score very well. It says, in the opening of the letter, Johnson explains why it is so long for him to write her back. He says, in my delay in answering your letter, to destroy any hope that you had formed. In that first sentence, he was basically saying that there was no chance of him being able to get her son sent to the university, but he didn't come out and say it, so he sugarcoated it in a way. Then he goes on to explain his concept of happiness and how it's flawed. In the first sentence of paragraph 2, he questions why she should ask him to perform this task when he never seen or spoken to before. Okay, right away we can notice something. First of all, there was no thesis statement. They just launched right into their analysis. So as an audience, we have to scramble and try to figure out, well, what is it they're trying to tell me here? Not only that, but if you notice, almost all of what we read right there was simply a summary, right? He said this. He's basically saying, right, telling us what it's meaning, right? Down here, first sentence, what he's saying. It's just summarizing what he's saying and not talking about the strategies he's using to say it. The closest they come to doing something like rhetorical analysis is when they mention here that the author sugarcoated it, but they only mentioned it in passing. They didn't give any examples. They didn't do anything like that. They just said sugarcoat. If they would have given some examples, explained why sugarcoating was a strategy the author used, how it affected the audience, they might have done a better analysis. But because they only stuck with summary and what they were kind of comfortable with, it ended up being only a 2. So, to close out, whenever in this piece of writing you're actually writing about one of the strategies, so you've done your thesis statement, you've kind of set it up, and now you're trying to write about a specific strategy. You should do this about 3 times in your essay, but here are the things you should be considering when you write that. First of all, every time you talk about a new strategy, you need to make sure you're explaining and naming the strategy that you see being used, that you actually explain what the strategy is. Don't take for granted that your audience knows what these strategies you're mentioning even are. So you would want to even define that strategy a little bit. Then you would want to actually quote an example or multiple examples of the strategy being used in the text. You need to actually go back and show your audience what an example of the strategy, what the strategy looks like in action, okay, from the actual text. And then finally, you would want to explain how the strategy works. Okay, this is the part where you really make your grade, right? If you can explain how that strategy works, if you can talk about the effect it has on the audience and why the author chose that strategy, you will have written a good rhetorical analysis. One of the best ways to prepare for the rhetorical analysis essay is to know your rhetorical terms. And that means going back and reviewing those things and making sure you know what some of the strategies are and have memorized what some of these strategies are that authors like to use. This will help you out a lot so that when you start approaching this essay, you already know what you're talking about. One of the biggest ways you can get yourself into trouble in this essay is to not really know about any strategies. So it's going to be really important that you review some of these rhetorical terms and some of the videos we have on here and presentations that your classmates made so that you have a good base of knowledge for the rhetorical analysis essay. If you have any questions about the rhetorical analysis essay, make sure to come talk to me and we can try to figure out where your weaknesses are. All right, I hope this was helpful and we'll see you next time.